Welcome to my channel where we cover the lore of video games. We cover all kinds from the mainstream to the indie, so I hope you enjoy your stay, and welcome to the Chronicler of Lore. Kral has noticed that something's changed in Sharlayan, and she thinks that it's very important to figure out why the Forum is keeping its people from helping with the towers. Unfortunately, none of the Sharlayans are willing to talk, at least not the ones who know anything, so asking questions won't get you anywhere. That's why Kral has decided to start hunting for information in the far more old-fashioned and boring way of going through Sharlayan's archives to see if she could find out anything about the final days. It's a slow process doing that by herself, but she thinks it'll go faster now that she has a few people willing to sift through a few thousand books with her. So she takes the Warrior of Light, the twins, and Grahatia with her to the Numenon to get started with the most difficult and dangerous task the Warrior of Light has ever been on: reading. The Numenon is where the Sharlayans keep one of the biggest collections of books in history. The main building is only just the entrance to the place since it goes very deep underground. To put it into perspective, the Great Google Library could fit inside of the Numenon multiple times without filling the place up, which is great for people who love books, but not so great for people who are looking for specific, potentially world-saving information. Pretty much anyone has access to most of the place, but there are some restricted sections where only Archons can go. Kral has already sent Graha and Ishtola to start searching in those areas, while she has the twins helping her go through some of the books that are open to the public. Since the Warrior of Light's not a citizen at all, she doesn't have access to anything past the first floor. But Kral still thinks there should be some useful information there for you to find on the Forum's history, so you head inside and get to work. In the midst of hunting for all of the books on the history of Sharlayan, the Warrior of Light finds the book that Ishtola uses to stay young forever. The technique is one that most people have actually used once or twice. All you do is just pick an age and stick with it. That's how I've stayed 27 for 8 years. Once the Warrior of Light has learned the basics about Sharlayan's history, she heads outside to meet up with the others. They've all grabbed some books to go through, but from what Graha saw, there wasn't much of anything on the final days in the Archon section. So it's gonna be a lot of time spent sifting through the other books that they grabbed. Alice wishes things were different so she could do the research at her parents' home, but her dad was serious when he said that they weren't welcome there. She did talk to one of her house servants because of course they're rich enough to have plenty. And she was told that her dad said that if the twins did manage to get back into the city, they weren't allowed in the house under any circumstances, which is a bit harsh, but it kinda makes sense since they've been disowned. Graha hopes that if they find out why the Forum is acting the way that they are, it could help put an end to the twins' exile. Alice is sure that her family will get its crap together eventually, but she's more curious about whether Graha visited his family since they've been in the city, if his people even live in the city. He was actually born in Corvos out in Ilzabard, and that's where his people have been since they were brought there as slave labor for the Allagans. A lot of Makote tribes left the area when the freezes of the 5th Calamity hit, but Graha's ancestors stayed for the sole purpose of making sure that what the Allagans left behind wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. They likely failed since the place was taken over by Gallians and renamed Locusamonis. When he was young, an imperial family with the very familiar name of Darnus took over a nearby town, and they were extremely interested in the Allagan tech, so Graha's tribe started making plans. Since the Allagan Eye had stopped getting passed down to the eldest children of their clan as much as it had been in the old days, to avoid any problems with the Imperials, they abandoned their old traditions and hid all of their Allagan knowledge. Then they gave Graha to the students of Valdesian who got him registered as a citizen of Sharlayan. So while their story was interesting, Graha proved that he's one of those guys who when you ask him how his day's going, he tells you a 30-minute story about how he forgot to delete his search history before he let his girlfriend use his laptop, and now he's sleeping on the couch. Fortunately, he and Alice decide to dive back into their research before the world ends, and they get to work while the Warrior of Light waits for Kral and Alphino to show up. The pair decided to sift through some papers that the Forum members wrote about the different calamities, because it's possible that they found out about the final days while studying the other calamities. It's a good idea, but since Kral didn't see the final days like the rest of you did, she wants you to fill her in on what you saw in Amarat before she gets back to work. After telling her about how the Ancients' creation magic went haywire and caused their fear to manifest into some terrifying ways that included meteors falling out of the sky and really strange monsters trying to eat them, Kral starts to get an idea about how bad it actually was. She just wishes that she had access to some of the Ancients' creation magic to help understand how it all worked. But the closest thing that still exists as far as she knows are the rituals that the Ascians taught to the beast tribes on how to summon primals, and she's not really willing to experiment with that. The only other bit of information that you have for her is that the whole thing started when the Ancients heard a weird sound. None of the Scions heard it since they were in the process of dodging explosions at the time, but the sound apparently covered the entire star by the time everything was said and done, and it didn't end until Zodiark was summoned. Granted, the Scions have no idea how Zodiark stopped the final days, so in other words, they don't know much of anything about what they're dealing with or how the Telophoroi plan on restarting the final days in the first place. But before they can worry about that, they have to deal with the Forum, which means it's time to dive into paperwork while you wait for Y'shtola to show up since she's still somewhere in the library. When she finally shows up, she's not feeling all that positive about the book she's found, because just like the books that Urianger read to learn about the different shards, it's unlikely that any books with info on the final days will be left out where just anyone could find them. But Fortunal had seemed pretty confident that the Forum would know if the final days were actually happening, which likely means that the only citizens of Sharlayan who know anything about what's coming are the Forum members. That doesn't mean that Y'shtola thinks nothing of value will come from going through the books, and she brought enough to give the Warrior of Light something to do too. After reading for a few hours, Alice decides that you've earned a break, and she takes you to a place called The Last Stand, which is Sharlayan's only cafe, because apparently they don't waste time on mundane things like competition and business. It's crowded, which gives the two of you the chance to hear how the people feel about what's going on in the world. It's not all that surprising to hear that most of the general public haven't heard all that much about the upcoming end of the world. But when the Warrior of Light mentions it, it does explain to one guy why his friend who's a gleaner has been extra busy lately. The Gleaners are Sharlayan's version of adventurers, meaning they send them all over the world on fetch quests for everything from rare books to live animals. Lately, they've been extra busy bringing things to Sharlayan, which would make sense if the Forum thought the world was about to end. They'd want to preserve all of the knowledge and wildlife that they could. That means talking to one of them would likely be more worthwhile than chatting with regular folks. So after sharing a cup of coffee with Alice and giving her time to get a few things off her chest, she decides to hunt down some gleaners, which won't be all that hard since she sees a few of them on boats loaded with stuff that she says they're likely taken to a place called Labyrinthos. Sharlayan has an enormous underground facility where they keep the more lively bits of knowledge that they've gathered from around the world. Up top, they keep their libraries filled with millions of books. Underground, they have a giant nature preserve filled with all types of plants and animals. And not all of them are the cute and cuddly kind. They were always sending things down there when Alice lived in the city. But that's the first time she'd ever seen a shipment so big, which confirms what the Warrior of Light heard. The Forum is using the Gleaners to prep for the end of the world. That means that the information you're looking for will likely be found in Labyrinthos, which means it's time for the Scions to head into the underground research facility and track down a Gleaner who will hopefully be more willing to talk than the rest of the Sharlayans have been. And that's where we're going to stop for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.